another CreateScape tutorial. In this tutorial I'll be showing you how to use Blender to make a very simple and very realistic moving stream animation. The sort of animation that if you were to use the simulation tools in Blender, the fluid simulation tools, would be very CPU intensive and require certainly a very long render time, if not a long computational time. So anyway, you can see on the screen at the moment a picture that I took the other day on one of my lockdown walks. It's a really lovely little stream, a place called Bennett's Mouth in North Devon. And I wanted to just show you a way of animating or creating and animating that stream. So what you need to do first is you need to get your own video footage of the water flowing. So this is what I took. I just used my iPhone and I got as vertical as possible on top of the water, and I took a movie file, I think 10 seconds, or I think maybe 20 seconds in this instance, but that's all I did. Try and get as vertical as possible, and obviously don't have your shadow over in the recording, but just try and get a clear unobstructed view of the water running. Okay, so once you've got all of that and you've saved it somewhere you can find it again, I want you to open Blender. So I've got Blender already open, so this is the default scene. First thing to do, as normal, is to select the default cube, press X and delete it. Now I want you to go Shift A, Mesh, and add a plane, and we're going to call this the stream. It's always a good idea when you're using Blender to, whenever you create new objects, to make sure you're keeping them correctly named and well organized in the tab up here. Okay, at the moment we don't need to worry about rescaling or resizing, but what I do want you to do is I want you to again select the plane, press Tab to enter edit mode, and then right click on the object, click subdivide. Now at the bottom left you'll see a little panel coming up, subdivide. Open that, and I want you to go for, let's go for 15 subdivisions. Press return and left click to finalize that change, and you'll see that what it's done is it's actually divided each edge of the square into 15 individual squares. The reason we do that is later on when we're trying to apply a deformation procedure to this mesh to give us the texture or the bumps of the water, Blender needs to have a lot more vertices to work with than just the 4 from the original plane. So we'll leave that at the moment. Okay, so that's pretty good. The next thing that we're going to do then is we are going to apply the movie that you took of the screen onto this plane as a material. So using your cursor, position it at the joint of the two windows here, click and drag to open a new window, and at the top left of the new window open up here, or left click here and select shader editor. Now you can see that we don't have a lot of space to work with. My screen isn't particularly big, and so if you want to get rid of this right hand panel, in the active window, click in the active window and then press N to remove the number properties. You can do that in the left hand window as well if you wish. Click in the active window, press N to remove that. Okay, so you won't see anything in the right hand window yet, so let's fix that. Select the stream object, go down on the right hand side here and select the little pink circle called materials, and I want you to click new, and we will call this, double click where it says material, we will call this water. So what we've done there is we have created a new water material, and you can see at the top here that it is under the stream object. So zooming in, these are called nodes. So the way in which we create and connect the nodes makes a difference to how the object will appear. What we have here is we have a BSDF node, a principled node. This is just your basic node for an object. We can change the color Let's change it to a pink, and at the top here we will change the viewport shading. Here it is solid. We want to click at least here to material preview. You can see that the color of that has changed if we were to change it to yellow or whatever. But let's go back to somewhere white. Okay, so what I want you to do now is we are going to apply the movie texture to be the color of that object, the movie file to be the color. So in the shader window, please click on the principled shader here, and I want you to press Control T. Now what should happen is that you should get an additional 3 nodes appear. These are texture mapping. This is a texture mapping arrangement, and I won't bore you with the description of all of them, but basically you see here image texture. This is where we want to load in your movie file. So I want you to click on open, and I want you to, in the dialog box that opens up, I want you to find where you stored your movie file. Right, I happen to know that that is the movie file that I want. So, and you can see in the left hand side that at least the appearance or the color of the first frame of that movie has been applied to the plane. Good. So let's just go down the other settings here. Won't worry about linear or flat. We need to make sure that it is identified as a movie. The number of frames, we are going to use 250 frames as our standard animation, and we are going to start at frame number 1, and we'll call the frame offset 1. We want it to be cyclic, so when it finishes to restart again, and I want you to click auto refresh. Just before we go any further, make sure at the bottom here in your timeline that you have the start frame as 1 and the end frame as 250. If either of those values are incorrect, just click in that box and type in the correct value and press return. Okay, so keeping your eye on the left hand screen, let's just press play, and you can see that now the movie is playing almost as if it's being projected onto the top surface of that object, which is exactly what we want. Let's pause that for the moment. Let's look at that. If we move the screen, move the camera around, you can see that whilst the movie looks good from the top, when we press play, there's absolutely no three-dimensional aspect to it. It's clearly only a two-dimensional movie being projected onto a flat plane. So the next thing to do is we're going to fix that. The way we are going to fix that is by the use of something called a displacement modifier. So again, on the right hand side, if you go to the little blue spanner, modifier properties, click on that, making sure that the stream object is selected. I want you to click add modifier, and we're looking for displacement. Now you can see that it jumped up but didn't do anything else at the moment. I won't bore you with well, I will explain to you why it jumped up. If you look to the right hand side, as soon as we applied that modifier, it basically set up a displacement modifier with strength of 1 and a mid-level of 0.5. Now the mid-level just means that for a given range of displacements, the midpoint is at a value of 0.5 above horizontal. So if we change that, the mid-level position changes. Don't need to worry about that at the moment. We'll just change it back to 0.5. But the reason we don't see any other effect is that we haven't told the computer how to deform this, how to displace it. So if you look at the top here, you will see where it says new and a little checkered box here. If you click on that little checkered box, sometimes you will have the movie file, and you can just go for that. But in this case, we don't have that, so I want you to click new to create a new texture. We will call this water. Let's just have another check there. No, there's nothing there, so just call it water, and then go down to the bottom here where we have the red checkered icon, which is texture properties, and making sure that we still have water up here, I want you to open, click on open, and then go to your movie file again. References. Okay, so that is mine. Excellent. So what you'll see on the right hand side, you'll see that the movie file has now been loaded into that texture. We'll just check that the source here is a movie. That's correct. The number of frames, we need to change this to 250 to tell the computer to use all 250 frames, starting at frame number 1 and offset 1 again like we did on the other panel. Okay, let's make it cyclic, auto refresh. I think that's okay. Right, as you will have noticed that when we applied that, it got very spiky. If we press play, you'll see that clearly the movie is playing and it's affecting the displacement of the plane object, but it's not really the effect that we want. So press pause, return it to the beginning of the timeline. And what I want you to do is go back up to the modifier panel, and then we're looking here under the displacement modifier, the strength. So we're going to turn that down, I would say 0.05. Let's have a look. Well, maybe a little bit more is required. 0.1. That looks a little bit better. Let's press play. Yeah, that looks pretty good. If you catch the light on it, you can see that it's a little bit pixelated. There's lots of squares here. We can fix that by right-clicking and clicking on Shade Smooth. Okay, so that's not bad actually. Yep, maybe just a little bit more. Let's try it. 0.11. Yeah, I think that's okay. Good. Right, so you can see now that we've got something that looks like actually quite a good approximation of running water, but there's a few extra things I want to do to make it even more real. The first thing is to create a more realistic environment around the water for shadows and lighting. So the way that we do that, let's pause this. The way that we do that is that we load into the scene something called an environment texture, which is a 360-degree texture that basically allows the computer to calculate how the surrounding image or the surrounding lighting, the surrounding objects can affect the item that we're looking at. So again, on the right hand side, click on the world properties button here, which is a little world with a arrow either side, and I want you to click on the color, go for environment texture, and what you do is you load in an HDRI, a high dynamic range image. Now let me just navigate to my HDRs. I keep them, a library of them that I keep in a certain place. I happen to have a forest HDRI, so let me just load that in so you can see what I'm talking about. Let's go up to here. It's taken some time to load in, unfortunately. Okay, so there it is. So what you can see is that what I've got is an image that completely surrounds the object that I'm working on and just allows some reflections from these sort of trees or the sun or the surrounding environment to reflect into the water, the reflections on my water. To see that, I think you need to have your viewpoint mode here as rendered, but that's fairly good. Now I've obviously got this HDRI in my library. If you don't have an HDRI image like this, then you can go to www.hdrhaven.com. I'll give you the link in the description of this video, and that's a really good resource for some high quality free HDRs that you can use for creating that little extra bit of realism. Okay, Going up to the top right, we no longer need the light, so I'm going to delete that by right-clicking and pressing delete. Let's go back to our water. Press play to remind ourselves what it looks like. Okay, good. Time to move on. Left click on the plane object. We're going to do a few extra tweaks now to the material, or the shader. The first thing I would like you to do is left click on the principled shader and do Shift D to duplicate it. Move the duplicated copy further up to the top. Now what we're going to do here is, when you look at water, you know, sometimes water is very reflective and shiny, and sometimes the water is transparent, depending on the angle at which you're looking at it. It's called the Fresnel effect, but I won't go into why that happens right now. But we've got to simulate that, and whilst Blender does have some built-in Fresnel effects, I personally don't find them very useful or realistic, and I think it's better to fake the effect as we're going to do now. So you've duplicated the two shaders, or you've duplicated the one shader to create a second. What I want you to do, in the specular channel at the top, turn that up to about 0.7. In the specular channel at the bottom, turn it down to 0. And likewise for the roughness, I want you to turn up the roughness on the bottom specular, the bottom shader, and then turn down the roughness on this shader at the top. What that basically means is this shader is going to be very shiny and reflective, and this is not going to be shiny and reflective. But by connecting this link from the color output of the movie texture to the color input of the upper shader here, you'll find that both shaders are going to be using the same movie as their starting point. Now, when we're working within nodes, it's very helpful to have something called the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. So go up to Edit, now Preferences, and in the search box I just want you to type in Node, N-O-D-E. There should be a minimum of 3 boxes that come up, one of which should say Node Wrangler. Make sure that that checkbox is enabled, and you can simply close the window. What that allows us to do is it allows us to, using Shift, Control, left click, we can click on any node in our shader setup and see the output of that node. So if, for example, I Shift, Control and left click the original movie, you'll see this is the original movie. If I left Control, Shift and left click this upper shader, you'll see what I meant about it being much more reflective and looking a little bit shiny. Whereas if we look at the bottom in the same way, you'll find that it's not so shiny, it's not reflective. Now, what we've got to do is we've got to find a way of telling the computer where to apply the shiny material and where to apply the non-shiny material. And the way we are going to do that, it's a little bit of a cheat, but again, it's easy. I want you to go up and click Add, Converter, Color Ramp, and put that up here, and connect the color output of the movie node to the input of the color ramp. And now Control Shift left click onto the color ramp to show the output of that node. What I want you to do is zoom in a little bit and then click and drag these slider bars towards one another. What you can see on the left hand side is that is making the image or the movie, instead of a grayscale type effect, it's pretty much going to a black or white effect, black and white effect, which is what we want. So we're going to use that output from this color ramp to tell the computer where to apply these shaders. Now how we do that is we look at the output from these two shaders and it's green, so that tells us that it's a shader output. So then we add in a new node. We want to look under the shader group and we want to go for mix shader. So we'll put that there. We'll connect the top shader to the top input of the mix shader node. the bottom shader to the bottom shader input of the mix shader node, and we'll connect both of those to the material output. Okay, so if we now left click on that, Control Shift left click on that node, you can see that the material is now a combination of sort of shiny and non-shiny, but it looks very artificial, and that's because we haven't actually used our grayscale map from the color ramp to tell the computer which parts to put the shiny on and which parts to put the not shiny, so it's basically just mixed the two equally. So all we need to do now is from the color output of the color ramp, bring that down to the factor here, and what you'll see is that if we play now, we've got a much nicer, much more realistic appearance of the water. Now we could leave it there. I think that's a nice looking flow. If you come down here, you know, you've still got your geometry, and you got the hint of the stones underneath. But something you'll notice when you look at real streams is that the flow pattern and the flow rate in the center of the stream is different to the flow rate and the flow pattern at the edges. And I think it's quite important that I show you a little trick to at least fake that effect. So let's pause this for the moment. What I want you to do now then is I want you to go up to Add, and I think it's Input, no, it's Texture, and we'll go for a wave texture. If we left Control Shift and left click on that, you can see what the wave texture looks like. This is obviously not the sort of eddies that you would see on the side of a stream, but if we use the distortion value here and click and drag that to the right, you'll see that that texture starts to get distorted until it kind of resembles the sort of waves and eddies that we would see on the side of a stream. You might want to increase the scale a little bit to make that more appropriate for the image that we've got, but you play around that until you have a pattern, a black and white pattern that looks reasonable to you in terms of how waves and eddies should be at the edge of the stream. Now what we've got to do now then is we've got to find a way of telling the computer when to apply this wave pattern and when to apply this wave pattern, because we only want the eddies from this pattern to be along the edges of the stream, correct? Okay, so the way we do that is in weight painting, but before we do that, I just want to check which way our stream is actually running, because I've forgotten. Okay, good, so it's running down, that's the middle of the stream. Okay, so what I want you to do now is in the left hand window, go up to Solid Display as solid, and then change the mode from object to vertex paint. You don't immediately see any change, but what we're going to do now is I want you to go up to the top and do, instead of draw, make this subtract, and the radius is 50, that's okay, strength is 1. If you find when your windows are minimized or smaller, you can't see all of the commands at the top here, what you need to do is press and hold your middle mouse button, your mouse wheel, and then move it to the left and right until you get to where you want to go. Okay, so about 50, and a strength, I think we'll decrease the strength to about half, and what I want you to do is very slowly to paint onto the outside edges of this square where we want the wave pattern from to go. We're telling the computer where to apply. Okay, so anything that is black is where we're going to tell the computer to apply completely the wave pattern. Anything that is white is going to be where to apply the original video footage, and in between there will be obviously some compromise or some combination of the two. For the purposes of the tutorial, that's probably okay. You don't want to have a straight line, a clear demarcation. You want it to be a little bit wavy. If we felt that was a little bit too chunky, we could decrease the strength some more, we could increase the radius of the brush and just put a few more, lighter blends in. So we've got a nice blend between the black and the lighter color. Okay, so go out of vertex paint, go back into object mode. What we're going to do now is that we are going to combine this texture. Let me go back to here. This texture with the noise texture. And so if we look, again, we're talking about combining. We look at the outputs of these two. We see they're both yellow. Yellow is color. So we'll go to add, color, mix RGB. So we'll put this one into there and this one into there. And now for the factor of that, yes, sorry, let me go back a step. So when we have, let's go back into vertex paint. Make sure, don't press here because we'll start painting again. Let me go back into here. Yep, so this is the vertex map. When you are in vertex paint and you have solid mode selected so you can see the vertex map that we've just created, go over to the right hand side, click on this little green triangle, and under vertex colors here you will see that Blender, as soon as we started painting this, Blender created a vertex color group called col. We're going to change that to, we'll call it edge, okay, to remind us that this is the map for the edge of the stream. So call it edge, left click to confirm that. It's very important that you note whether you're using capital letters, because we must, when we use this name again, we must repeat exactly how we've typed it in. So capital E, D, G, E. Okay, let's go back to object mode up here. We'll go back to the rendered mode. And now we will go back up here, and I want you to do add and input attribute. This allows us, this node allows us to include the attribute edge. So the color, the vertex color group called edge is now allowed to influence our material. So if we Control Shift left click on this, you will see this is the color map that we prepared just recently. And so we're going to use that as the factor in combining our two patterns. To remind you, we have our wave pattern, we have our stream pattern, and then combining them using this map means that we get a combined output. That's kind of what we want, okay? So we will use the output from this mix shader will be the input into the mix shader to tell us where to apply the shiny material and where to apply the non-shiny material. So the combined output of this will now go into surface. Excellent. Now, it may not look like we've done anything different there, but if you press play, let's go here, you will see that there's a very subtle difference in the flow patterns between here and the outside. Just a very subtle difference, and we can improve on that. Okay, so let's press pause. Let's go up here, and now let's Control Shift and left click on the wave texture. If we press play on the animation now, you can see that it doesn't really change. The actual pattern itself doesn't change. So what we're going to do is go back to the beginning, make sure you're on frame 1, which you can do by clicking on this little button here. So frame 1, I want you to hover your cursor over phase offset and press I. It should go yellow to indicate that we've inserted a keyframe. And then I want you to use this button to go to the end of your animation, so frame 250, and we're going to go back up to phase offset and we're going to type in 200, and we're going to press I again to insert a second keyframe. If we go back to the beginning of the animation and press play, you will see that this pattern now changes. Not very much, but enough to suggest some sort of alteration. If we wish to make it a little bit more variable, we could do the same thing with things like the detailed scale. So we could set a keyframe here at the beginning. We could go to the middle of the animation, say 125, and we could change the scale, whoops, a little bit more. We could now type in another one, keyframe by pressing I in the middle. Then we could go to the end and we could change it a little bit more, and again press I to keyframe that. And what you'll see is that if we play through the animation now, we're getting some variation on our edge ripples. Okay, what that means when we go back to the output, the final output of this material, so we can click here. Sometimes I find in Node Wrangler, if you just click on the output left, so Control Shift left click, it doesn't always bring you back. So if necessary, you can click on the viewer node here, delete, and then Shift Control left click here again. Let's play this, see if that is working. Yep, that looks good. You can see now that the difference in texture on the edge is more pronounced than it was before. Just to make sure that we are happy with this, let's just switch these two over, see if it improves things. Nope, doesn't improve things. Okay. Good. Okay, so that's good. I think that is us done. So there you go. I'm not going to show you how to create all of the logs and the grass that was in the animation that I did as the teaser for this tutorial, because that's a separate topic. It's enough for me to say at the moment that I used the Grassveld add-on to create all that material, but that's looking pretty good. So if you have any if you're not certain about how to render that, let's just do that now quickly. So let's stop the animation. We'll go back to the beginning. What I am going to do is I want you to go up to View and Cameras, Active Camera. You can see that we're quite a long way away from the camera view. So I now press Shift F, and using the W, A, S and D keys, you can now move your camera in until you get to somewhere that you are fairly happy with. Let's zoom in. I want quite a nice low angle. Okay, and now left click to finalize that position. Let's just run the animation to make sure we're happy with it. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Go back to the beginning, and now we go over to our render tabs. Check that you're in Eevee. This will also work in the Cycles rendering engine, but it will take a significantly longer time to render, and I'm not convinced, well in fact I'm fairly sure that Eevee gives a better output in this case. So we'll have the render engine will be Eevee. I'm not going to bother with any of these effects at the moment. We go into the next tab. So I'm going for an output resolution of 1920 by 1080 and 100%. Right at the bottom we have the output. It's good practice to actually render your output as JPEGs or individual images, so one image for each file, and then recombine them later in the Blender video sequencer to make a movie file. But for such a small animation as this, I don't think it's necessary. The reason we normally do that is if your machine crashes or it takes too long to render, you want to be able to just render a frame at a time so you don't lose work, or you don't have your computer locked up for a week whilst you're rendering a complex animation. So in this instance though, 250 simple frames, we can make the output a movie file. Decide where you want that file to go using this button, and then go up to render animation. Now depending on how quickly your computer, or how powerful your computer is, you'll see that these frames will start now being created. My computer's not very high spec, but it's okay. So I'm just going to leave you for a few minutes whilst this is rendering. So back again, finished rendering the 250 frames. Let's go and find the output. So open up your Explorer. I think I put it in the temp drive, I think. Let's have a quick look. Here we go. 9, is that today? 9:48, I think that's the one. Yep, that's the right time. Let's double click that, see how we're doing. There we go. So it's a little bit fast, but you can slow that down in your editing program if you want. But yeah, pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. You can see nice reflections here from the surrounding environment, the woods and the branches. You can see the geometry of the water has been displaced over the underlying stones of the stream bed, and you can see the nice sort of translucency in the water. So excellent. So there you have it. That's how you make realistic flowing water, simply within Blender without having to run a very complex fluid simulation. Brilliant. Thanks very much, and make sure you check out the other videos coming in the future on this channel.